Welcome to our panel discussion on trade and immigration. Overall, this has been one of the most polarizing issues within libertarianism. Unfortunately, it's one of those issues where there's often not enough nuance in the debate. We've all known of people who've identified as libertarians on issues such as political correctness, on cultural issues usually, and who can usually see the merits in free trade. But then when the question of immigration comes up, often it's heavily politicized. And these discussions are often based on emotion and rhetoric from both sides, really. So it really helps to be able to clear the air and find out what the facts are and what a nuanced, solid libertarian position ought to be. So to introduce our first panelist today, we have Gabriela D'Souza. She's an economist from Melbourne, and she does research on issues including immigration policy. So give her a hand.
To check if this works for a second. Hang on. Great. Yeah, cool. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here to my talk, or to our talk today. I'm so thrilled to be here sharing the stage with Dara and Raina. I was hoping to start this talk today with a bit of a story, if you'll indulge me. And it's a story about a young boy. This young boy and his family grew up on the streets of Bombay in India, and a 6x4 portion of the pavement covered by blue tarp was his home for the first few years of his life. He and his family would have been at the very bottom of not just the income ladder in India, but he was at the bottom of the global income ladder. However, in a matter of a few decades, he rose to the top of that income ladder, the top 1%, which in today's dollars is anyone earning around 54,000 Australian. How is this kind of income growth possible? Did he win the lottery? Did he come into inheritance from a distant relative? Did he marry rich? No, he was given a different kind of lottery ticket. And that ticket was the freedom to move so that he could determine his own economic future. At the end of almost 40 years living in the Arabian Gulf, he managed to amass enough savings to educate his kids at universities overseas and to enable them to make decent lives for themselves. I should know. I'm his daughter. In a recent study, former World Bank economist Branko Milanovic estimated that about 59% of the variation between people's wages globally was dependent on where they were born, implying that not only was the country where you were born in an important aspect of your earning potential, it was the most important characteristic about you. Other studies have shown that people from some countries could increase their incomes by about 6 to 14-fold by moving alone. Yet they cannot, because we place restrictions on the ability of people to move. Prominent economist Danny Roderick has suggested that even a minor liberalization of an advanced country's restrictions on the use of foreign workers would produce a large impact on global incomes. In fact, the gains from this move would outstrip comfortably any other proposal that is currently on the table. Migrants also spend some of the money that they earn overseas and send that back home as remittances. The World Bank estimates that officially recorded remittances to low and middle income countries reached about $500 billion in 2017. And it is one of the more effective aid mechanisms that we have in place. Some estimates put the global remittances flow at 3 times larger than the global aid budget. This chart up here shows a case study of remittances from the UAE to India. And we can see that almost 20% of the total remittances to India was from the Gulf, from the UAE. In Australia, that's a bit lower, but that's also a function of some other things which we can get into in questions if you want. And now you may ask, but what's in it for the countries that these people migrate to? There's been a lot of spirited debate about whether migrants depress local wages, However, the evidence has shown that in most cases, the impacts are either small and negative, or small and positive, or negligible at all. A number of studies of refugee waves have found little or no impact on the employment of native-born workers in the cities where the refugees go to. The small or zero effects hold whether the refugees go to rich countries, poor countries, or simply to neighbouring countries. In 2005, a prominent economist, Card, found little or no harm from Mexican immigration to the US, and some studies even find that immigration raises native-born wages by prompting the locals to go back to school and improve their skills. Australia has one of the highest rates of foreign-born population in the world. Across the world, the number of people living outside of their home country is about 3%. In Australia, it's 28%. Australia, in that regard, is dwarfed only by countries whose labour force consists of overseas workers, like where I'm from, the United Arab Emirates, which is up to about 80%, I think. Immigration historians like George Megalogenis and Peter Mayers and others have chronicled Australia's history with migration, and overwhelmingly the successful integration and assimilation of waves upon waves of migrants who have made Australia a home over the years. I wrote a paper last year identifying the impact that Australia's tight selection policies have changed the shape of the most recent cohorts of migrants. Between 1994 and 1996, the Department of Immigration greatly expanded the number of skilled migrants over the number of family migrants. I looked at the sample of individuals that arrived before and after this change and identified that the skilled migration system is working well to ensure that migrants of high earning potential migrate to Australia, thereby contributing to economic growth. So, despite what you might hear about migration from One Nation Party senators, or more recently, New South Wales ALP MLCs, immigration has been good not just for the destination country, but for the people and their families who migrate. The values of our society is a part of what entices migrants to make other places home. Turning hostile is not the solution. As Milton Friedman once said, the clearest demonstration of how much people value their freedom is the way they vote with their feet when they have no other way to vote. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Gabby. It's interesting because one of the things that we're pushing for at the ATA is the legalization of nuclear power in Australia. And one of the arguments that gets made is there's no point. We just don't have the skills in this country. We don't have enough trained people to understand nuclear science and nuclear policy. The United Arab Emirates managed to build 3 or 4 massive-scale nuclear reactors recently. And they're able to do it because they have sort of an open immigration policy that allows people with the skills to come in and do the work. Our next speaker is Rainer Hoffers. He's the founder and director of the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, or CHIPS, in Jakarta. So give him a hand.
Thank you very much, Satya, and thank you very much to all the organizers for having me here. It's a great pleasure to speak. I'm going to talk here on a panel on trade and migration. I didn't take it so much as immigration, but more on migration. But nevertheless, I think my presentation will try to take it a little broader, because I think we're dealing with cultural shifts and actually shifts in the mindsets of people, which are important to address because we all are trying to change policies in one way or another. So this is what I'm talking about. The fundamental issue that we are dealing with, and I'm with the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, so I'm based in Jakarta, and we are dealing with Indonesian policymakers, but the situation is quite comparable in many other countries, is that there's a human condition and then there's the globalist argument. So the human condition is really that first and foremost we're thinking of our survival. We're still these kind of animals that are trying to actually just make sure we survive. And on top of this, we have this ability to reflect on ourselves and actually to think about who we are. We seek recognition, we want equal treatment, so we are seeing ourselves confined within the group that is surrounding us. We are looking for this identity, we compare ourselves to these people. So this is basically confining us to a restricted space in which we look for these things. Daniel Kahneman wrote about System 1 and 2, fast and slow thinking, we have the Socratic argument, we have Francis Fukuyama with thymotic passion. So it's all these arguments that say, as a human, we're seeking recognition and equal treatment, and that defines us in a certain space. But yet, on the other side, we have this globalist argument that we're basically one humanity, that it doesn't matter where the product is coming from. It doesn't matter where the person is coming from. If the person is best suited, if the product is best suited in the market, then let the market regulate that. Most efficient allocation is through the market economy. It's an anti-nationalist argument because the boundaries don't matter anymore. It's all about humanity here. And this is a context that we're dealing with not just in trade and migration, but I believe in global politics. When it comes to elections, we have those who are more centered on their sheer survival and their relationships in their communities versus the globalists who are looking at a entirely different picture. We in our center, we are looking at two issues. One is food trade, international food trade. The other one is international labor migration. Labor migration, so it's not so much about immigration. This is for temporary labor migration to earn a living abroad and after that to go back home. Let me talk about food trade first. You look at the international food prices over the decades, they have come down. This is contradicting all the Malthusian arguments that food is getting scarce, therefore more expensive. All that not happening. Prices are coming down. What? We had a tremendous spike with the oil crisis in the 1970s that led to international food trade summits, etc., food security summits. And you have the spike at the very end, 2008. 2007-8. That was another crisis. We remember the Arab Rebellion. We remember so many domestic conflicts in many countries because the food prices were spiking. Indonesia was avoiding this because it had this complicated, sorry for this slide, self-sufficiency policy. So many laws that say we're not importing anything unless it's absolutely necessary. And that, of course, is decided by the government, whether that is absolutely necessary to import rice or any other product. All of these laws say we cannot import until the government says this is necessary. So with this, they had a rice import ban in 2006, which meant when the international prices spiked, Indonesians were safe because the market was decoupled from the global markets, was insulated, import ban was in place anyway, so Indonesia did not fall for this. The rice price did not transmit into the Indonesian markets. The problem at the same time was, though, last bullet point, because of domestic reasons, the rice price was still increasing. It didn't go 100% up, but it rose by 37% because of domestic productivity issues, etc. And now the bigger problem is that this continues. Now what we have avoided is the transitory food security in Indonesia. The temporary short-term crisis was avoided because we did not suffer from the global rice prices. However, now we have a chronic food security because the domestic prices keep rising, cause poverty and everything. And that's what we are addressing in our center. If you look at the beef prices, the orange line is the market global prices, the blue line is the Indonesian prices. Indonesians pay a fortune for beef. And I have spoken to many cattle exporters in Australia who would love to export more to Indonesia, but we have all the import restrictions. Rice price, way more expensive than the global prices. So you see, chronic food insecurity because of all these import restrictions and other market distortions in the country. We do lots of research on this in our center. And we are not the only ones. OECD calculated that Indonesians are basically, they have paid in 3 years, $100 billion premium on top of the prices because of the market interventions. In just 1 year, 2015, Indonesians paid 36 billion extra on food. And even the EU didn't manage to tax their people that much for food, even though they have a common agricultural policy in Europe. So it's incredible. And this hits the poorest the hardest. It is really having disastrous effects. Almost 20 million people cannot sustain their daily nutritional requirements. 37% of the kids under 5 are stunted. We have a terrible ranking in the indices globally that measure food security and hunger. So we have a real chronic food insecurity because of these policies. Now, why are these policies in place? We can talk about the policy, we can talk about this law, this regulation, that regulation. But what's underlying this is the fear to become dependent from other countries. What is underlying this is, and the first president of the country said that, we become beggars if we ask other people for their food. We need to grow our own food. Our ideal is we want to be exporters, then we are strong. So you compare yourself to the others, and you're saying we need to be stronger than them. We need to export. Importing is bad. Look at what Donald Trump does in his rhetoric. We need to have the trade balance positive, because otherwise what? We're importing more from them. That's unfair. We need to export more. Indonesians are very much like that. The whole argument about markets and anti-nationalism and so on are not heard, because people see themselves only as competing with others and see their sheer survival threatened by the fact that other countries want to send food to Indonesia, which in most other countries is the most normal thing ever. Now let me give you a second example, and that one is about migration. Gabi just gave a very nice look into this already, so I don't need to repeat that. There are lots of scenarios that lots of academics have done, and they all point to the fact that it's much better than foreign aid, definitely. And number two, it actually helps the rich country residents as well. They all come to that conclusion. This one is a scenario from 2006, a little older. I guess Gabi's numbers are much newer. So there's a benefit for everybody. So why not? Everybody does it. Indonesia also was benefiting a lot. If you look at the blue line, that's the FDI over the years, growing nicely. And the red line, that's the remittances being paid. It's a lot of money. 2014, $8.4 billion coming back. That's money that's not going to the National Planning Ministry. That's the money that's not going into big investment projects. That's money going directly to the households of the people in the countryside, helping them to do whatever they need. And ODA is irrelevant, the official development assistance, in comparison to this. So this was a significant amount of money that reduced poverty in Indonesia significantly over the years. However, the government decided to stop this. Not a good idea, especially not to the Middle East and also to several other countries. Now, why they want to stop this? It seems like a cash cow. Doesn't work, right? Well, this is one of the reasons, or the biggest reason, really. The media is full of abuse cases of Indonesians being subjected to torture, rape, and everything in other countries. And if they resist, they face the death penalty in Saudi Arabia and Malaysia and in many other countries. So this is just the nicest picture that I have of a tortured person. There are many others you could see. Horrible. It's just horrible what's happening to them. So government says, can't do that. But why? Because the government fears for its image, its reputation. We have to do something about it, but we can't stop it. So how do we stop it? Now, women who want to go abroad to work get detained at the Jakarta airport if it looks as if they're going to work abroad. So we wrote a letter to the minister. We said, that's against the human rights. You want to leave your country, you don't need to show a reason why you want to leave your country. No, they're detaining them right now for their own safety, as it's always said. But we also learned this morning, or yesterday, we should never judge a policy by its intentions, but rather by its outcomes. Outcomes, it brings down the remittances a lot. Outcome is now these people have no other income opportunity. And we also calculated that it's terrible enough, but it's only 0.5% of domestic workers that are subjected to abuse. It's terrible, but it's only 0.5%. The rest actually makes money and lives a good life. So we did this research on this issue, and just to cut a long story short, we celebrate them as heroes. We're coming up with stories, films, books. We've just produced a book on 12 Indonesian dreams about women who went abroad and came back as entrepreneurs. There's a lot of poverty alleviation happening through labor migration. Gender equality is an important one because young women, when they go abroad, they have been told not to speak up. You look to the floor, you don't look into the other person's eyes, and you don't speak unless you're told to say something. That's the education in countryside. When they go abroad, and then the household says, do you know how to clean the house? Now she has to answer, and she has no idea how to answer to that. So it's a training in confidence, it's educating them, they learn new skills. Technology transfer, they bring back technologies, they tell us that's the first time they used Hoovers, the first time they used ATM cards, the first time they used this and this and that. And they become entrepreneurs. So there is an incredible benefit for society in all of this. I'll cut this short. If anybody's interested in the story about ghosts and zombies, happy to do that in the Q&A, but I think I have to come to an end. What I want to say with this, and I'm coming to an end, it's my last slide, is that why are people stopping migration when it's obviously this beneficial. The president of Indonesia went to Malaysia and he had lots of things to talk about. Big trade issues, ASEAN issues, global issues, G20 issues, etc. But among other things, what he had to talk about was torture cases of Indonesian maids. I came back and he said, I'm embarrassed. I do not want to have to talk to the Malaysian Prime Minister about these kind of issues when I'm abroad. We should not let Indonesians be domestic workers in Malaysia anymore. So he was embarrassed. He didn't want to be subjected to this kind of situation. The manpower minister is embarrassed because he has asked Saudi Arabia to do something about all this abuse, and Saudi Arabia doesn't do anything about it. So he says, if they don't do anything about it, then we're not going to send anybody there anymore. We're stopping this. Because he's then in the newspapers, he wants to be re-elected next time. He's a politician. But the newspapers are full of abuse cases. So he's seeing himself, his survival as a politician, he's seeing his own reputation going down. He's comparing himself to the others and what they're doing. And that's the key motivation. And when you ask Indonesians, they would also say, we should not let our people go because it's very, very dangerous for them. Nobody talks about abuse cases in Indonesia. If they just go from one province to the other, they're subjected to the same kind of stuff. That's not the same as if they go to another group, another identity, where they're subjected to this. So I believe this is one of the biggest issues that we need to deal with as a classical liberal movement. And that is something that we have to really address carefully in our policy proposals. If we believe in markets and we all being one human species with one common objective and desires, then we need to address that very carefully because a lot of people still follow the human condition in their policy behavior. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. Our next speaker is Dara Lind. She's a senior reporter with Vox News, based out of Washington, D.C. She's covered immigration issues extensively for over 10 years, and she's been based at Vox since its founding in 2014. So give her a hand.
Hey, team. I don't have a PowerPoint because I am the world's worst 21st century reporter and I'm not comfortable with visuals. And ironically, while my co-panelists, Gabby and Rainer, have given you guys very fact-filled, informative presentations, despite being nominally a journalist, I'm here to talk to you about values. Not because I am trying to impose my values on you. I'm, of course, perfectly objective. But because the immigration debate, as it happens in politics and policy, is always about values, even when it pretends to be about facts. The conversations that people tend to have over and over again about, do immigrants have an upward or downward impact on the wages of natives? Do immigrants commit more crime than natives? All of these are questions that have answers, but the reasons that they're getting brought up are by political actors who are trying to put forward a particular vision for the nation that they are trying to express through the policy of who they're letting in. You can't really understand how immigration policy gets made without understanding that there are competing values and competing visions of the country that are at work when people try to debate it. And as a corollary, you can't really understand how immigration policy actually works if you don't understand that, just like any other program in which the government is trying to accomplish social engineering by trying to control by trying to express a certain value through policy, that social engineering may or may not go as the government intends. So I think of this as the healthy skeptic's guide to immigration policy, by understanding both the ways that the vision of the country that is trying to get put forward as the government makes immigration policy, and the ways in which that vision may not be best served by the things they're trying to do to get there. It's very tempting, because immigration is such a powerful elemental issue, and because the normative idea of what do we want our country to be is so strong, to either, especially in libertarian circles, default to the open borders side or to the, radical shut it down. We are being totally failed by our leaders side. I am here to tell you that you do not need to do that to have opinions on immigration policy, as long as you understand that those values are being expressed. Because the fact of the matter is the government isn't putting forward one single vision of what it wants the country to be. It's trying to do a bunch of things at once. Actual immigration policy as it exists in my country is in yours, and like sidebar here to say that I understand the American immigration policy system much better than the Australian one, and so I'm going to kind of default to that, although I do think there are important similarities in the stories that the countries have told about themselves. In either the American or Australian case, immigration is simultaneously supposed to ensure economic competitiveness. It's supposed to promote or manage assimilation or integration. It's supposed to serve humanitarian functions, and it's supposed to encourage the people who the most desirable immigrants to stay rather than to just kind of continue to shuttle back and forth. Those things, and especially once you get into the fact that economic competitiveness is easily split into various needs of various sectors in various regions at various times, mean the government is trying to do everything at once with immigration policy. You guys are, broadly speaking, better at it than we are because there's more flexibility in the Australian system. A lot of people say that the Australian and Canadian systems are more skill-based than the US system in terms of legal immigration. That's broadly speaking correct, but for my money, the most important difference between the US and the Australian and Canadian systems is that the Australian and Canadian systems have more flexibility year to year, with the government being empowered to set levels and to determine allocation of immigration slots, whereas in the US it's all set legislatively and hasn't been changed in decades. But the thing about trying to do everything at once is that it's not that you won't do any of it. It's just that you don't admit people just for their economic earning potential. You don't admit them just for their assimilability. And even if you admit them just for humanitarian purposes, like they live lives as full human beings in the receiving country. Government can't necessarily understand all of that. It can't necessarily evaluate someone based on all of it. And it certainly can't predict who is going to best succeed or which people they need to select to best accomplish their goals. So when I talk about having a healthy skepticism, I mean understanding that the government is making decisions based on less information than they claim to have, and is essentially trying to pick trying to make predictions about who is going to best succeed in a society that they haven't lived in yet. The thing about, when I say that immigration policy is social engineering, for the record, I don't mean that that's because you're stopping people from migrating when they naturally like to. I mean, yes, obviously, trying to prevent certain people and encourage others is a form of social engineering, but as long as we have the nation state, open borders is also a form of social engineering insofar as you're changing the political unit that you're trying to work with. But we talk about values usually in the context of like humanitarian immigration or in the context of immigration enforcement. And those two debates are obviously very closely tied to each other here, where the detention of asylum seekers is a major policy issue. It's also increasingly true. I think my country is going to start learning from your debate on this one, because our border security debate is increasingly about a flow of people seeking asylum. And there it's very obviously a question of values. On one hand, you have the idea of sovereignty. On the other hand, you have the commitment to humanitarian international law and the belief that you shouldn't turn people away to their deaths. Those are very obvious things, although it does end up being social engineering involved in how the government chooses to respond. But there's also values embedded in things that we think of as being very technocratic, like the point system for labor-based immigration here. Like that encodes values about what kind of person is best suited to participate in the economy. It encodes values about who's most likely to be integrated. It includes a tension between the idea of temporary immigration that's going to serve an industry and permanent migration that's going to best serve an economy. In the US, we have temporary work visas that are tied to particular employers, which makes a lot of sense for the employer and makes sense for a policy dealing with American firms, but doesn't put people in the best position to actually grow their careers, much less start their own businesses, because their legal existence in the US is tied to continuing to work for a particular person. There's also concerns about, integration versus preservation. In theory, permanent migration and migration of people who are most likely to want to stay in the receiving country, most likely to want to contribute to their communities, to bring their families over, those are the people who are going to be most deeply rooted in the society that they're coming to. But that's not necessarily what people think about when they think about immigration, and particularly integration. Usually what they're talking about is assimilability, which is usually defined as, can you become what we already are? Do you already speak our language? Are we going to have to communicate with you when you get here with difficulty and wait for you to learn, or are you already going to meet us where we are? Are you going to want to bring over your family members because they may not speak the language as well, they may not look like us, or are we going to tell you that you can come and live here, but your family can't? Those things don't necessarily facilitate integration per se. They don't facilitate people putting down deep roots. What they do facilitate is preservation of the existing society. You can argue for either one of those. You can, if you want to, argue that there are things that need to be preserved that are in danger of slipping away if we allow too many new people to determine who we are as a nation. But you can either argue that, or you can argue for greater integration. If you argue for preservation, you have to understand that people who are being pushed to the margins because they don't belong are going to stay at the margins, that they're not going to decide to become just like you when they're being rejected for being like themselves. This is not a debate that happens explicitly, but it's one that should. Because the people who are the way in which government tries to engineer integrability and assimilability ends up not cutting in the direction that it would like. There are no unassimilable people. I will say that again because I believe it so strongly and because the American history of immigration policy demonstrates it so strongly. There is no one who is unassimilable. There are ways that people can be better supported when they come. This is particularly true in humanitarian immigration, where people often don't have the language or economic skills that they would ideally need to stand on their own 2 feet from day one. But it's also true in contexts where you're a lower skilled worker or someone coming over as part of family-based migration. There are more and less things that governments can do, that civil society can do to support people who are just getting settled. But there is no such thing as a person who, after 2 or 3 generations, still acts as if they're in the country of their ancestry. There are so many reams of evidence from my country's history of not quite constant immigration, but like several waves over hundreds of years, that every time people have worried that, their immigrants' children will never learn the language, they'll never ascribe to our values, they'll never leave their ancestral religions, that people want to succeed in the country and the society that they're in. And if anything, the social science actually shows us that there's something of a second generation problem with many immigrant groups, which the US is dealing with Latinos right now, that while immigrants themselves often have lower crime rates than their native-born peers, and in some cases are better educated than their native-born peers, their children, second generation, regress to the mean for ethnic group of which they're a part, which in America says something about racial stratification, but also says something about integration, for better or worse. You've selected people who have successfully become Americans by the second generation. It's just that you don't like everything that represents. The good news about that, though, is that also means that people who you might not think of as economically productive citizens are going to end up surprising you. The examples that Rainer was giving of rural women who end up becoming entrepreneurs, very few countries are going to select a woman in rural Indonesia as a potential entrepreneur, because when they think of entrepreneurs, they think of people who already have the knowledge and resources. That's not true. Immigrant entrepreneurship in the US is actually highest among lowest skilled immigrants who are running small businesses. That's maybe not the kind of competitive 21st century economy that makes for great talking points, but It's something that a country that cares about small business, that cares about communities supporting themselves, would in theory value. It's just that it gets lost in the conversation because the conversation about economic immigration isn't really about what's the best thing for the economy. It's really about, do we want people who are going to help serve our existing firms, or do we want to become an economy that is, do we want to select the people who are going to help our economy best grow? It's not that this is not just about legal immigration either. Deterrence is a form of attempted social engineering. Deterrence, whether we're talking about what the U.S. is currently doing at the U.S.-Mexico border, or talking about the detention, the overseas detention of asylum seekers on Manus Island and Nauru, that's an attempt to engineer people abroad and control their choices as to whether or not they try to come to your country. You can argue the virtue, obviously the political valence of that and the normative valence of that are very different when you're talking about people who aren't your citizens. But if the argument against government social engineering is that it doesn't work any better when they're not your citizens either. The important thing about understanding deterrence as social engineering is that you can recognize that people who are making the decision to come already know the risks. They have very informed social networks. They understand what is likely to await them. If they are deciding to come anyway, they have made the calculation that it is better for them to take the risk and leave than it would be for them to stay. That is a very strong signal that they are sending. And to assume that it can be the fantasy of total control of immigration, while I understand it makes a certain amount of sense in a country that's surrounded by water, whereas in the US it's very obviously never going to happen. It makes assumptions about the ability to control not only space, but the behaviors of human beings. The thing about freedom is that humans are unpredictable and can surprise us for good as well as ill. And if we understand that and maybe take a slightly more relaxed, more skeptical view of what government could hope to accomplish with immigration policy and what sorts of people we can predict being able to accept or reject, it might be a little bit easier to talk about this extremely politically fraught issue and speak openly about what kind of society we want, rather than trying to hide all of our arguments in arguments about what is objectively true. Thank you.